What I'm here to talk about is largely to do with what we do at Gitcoin, which is around trying to sustain open source software. And this is not really a new problem. Open source software has been under-maintained and under-supported pretty much since it began, which was as early as sort of the 1970s or 1980s, depending on what you're counting, if you're counting hardware, software, and so forth. But in the last 10 to 20 years, this has actually really accelerated, in part because of the growth of open source software in the first place. And so before we start, what might make sense is to sort of discuss what do we mean when we say open source software in the first place. So first of all, we mean that the code is open. It's anyone can use it, anyone can review it. It is released to the public with no restrictions. There are royalty-free redistributions allowed of the program, so no one is making money off of the software. It's something that is available to anyone free of charge, as you might expect with something called free and open source software, often shortened to FOSS. And then finally, there are modifications that can be made to retain the original software license. What this basically means is there's a particular license that is used in a given piece of open source software that defines the terms of use set by the maintainer that cannot be changed. So once a maintainer says, this is an MIT license, this is a GPL license, then it is sort of, it has been written, that is it, that is the choice. And each of these licenses has different sort of terms and conditions and pros and cons that I won't get into in too much detail, but I would recommend looking into sort of MIT and GPL as the two first most common examples, MIT being sort of permissionless, but open to corporate adoption, GPL being restrictive in that no one can try to make money off the original software. So a corporation that decides to use this in their own proprietary software, the GPL case would run into issues as Richard Stallman intended it with his original reading of that. So why do we care about open source software? There are lots of public goods problems. The environment, climate, open source software is one example. There's things like roads, bridges, public infrastructure in the physical world. Why do we care about software in particular? I don't think I really need to explain that to this audience, but there are many audiences for whom it's not necessarily clear. And largely it's because we all use it. Everyone is using it. Everyone that's listening to this is using open source software right now. And we all need to be really considerate of the fact that given that we're using it so much, and that so much of the code on even a sort of like per line basis is from open source, and that it generates so much economic value, that open source maintainers who are providing all this value are being burned out. And part of that is as you'll see from this sort of chart here, most of the maintainers or most of the projects that we use have 1 to 2 maintainers, and are really, at sort of this place where if one person, this is what's known as the bus factor, one person stops maintaining that piece of software, it's no longer usable. It's no longer part of the ecosystem. And this is particularly important when it comes to kind of where we are with the usage of open source software today. And, why might this happen? Why might people decide as a maintainer to stop doing it? Because that value, that 387 billion that I mentioned before, is not really going to the maintainers. And so most people are actually self-funded. Their employer funds them. They do consulting services. They go for crowdfunding and donations. All these things are not necessarily sustainable. At any time, someone might have an issue with their family, they might have an issue with, say, a global pandemic, hypothetically, and these things really can impact long-term sort of sustainability of doing this work for free or for a nominal salary. And it's particularly important when we look at the numbers, especially relative to, like, say, 2001. Like, SourceForge had about 208,000 sort of bi-weekly users, people downloading software on SourceForge, if anyone remembers that. And now there's about 50 million users on GitHub. And that's sort of just within a 20-year span. And obviously that has an impact on the amount of work that maintainers need to do. And so the question is, how do you, as a maintainer, balance the amount of work that you need to do with what you're getting paid to do it and with your needs as an individual? And so this was just one example, Semantic UI, which was a really good sort of front-end framework, similar to, or a similar popularity at the time. Jack wrote this to maybe Vue.js, or maybe like half the popularity of, say, React.js, which is probably the most common standard to date. He obviously burned out. A more prominent example is the case of OpenSSL. And I think a lot of people in the open source software ecosystem are familiar with this. Essentially what happened was there was a critical vulnerability found that caused this widespread global computer virus called Heartbleed. It was exploited in order to basically ask people for money in exchange for unencrypting their data. And this was a huge issue. It was one of the, as this, it might be hard to read all of this in the time that I'll have this slide up, but one of the things I really want to call out here is that, many have called this the worst security bug ever, but it's a very serious, at the very least, security vulnerability. And this was caused because there's really one maintainer, and I think even to date, there's maybe 2 or 3 maintainers of OpenSSL, despite the fact that it powered, over 80% of the internet at the time that this happened, if I recall correctly. And, the mystery then, as this sort of states at the bottom, which I think is the really important point here, is not that, a few overworked volunteers missed this bug. It's like that this hasn't happened more often. And so that's a really challenging scenario to be in. I'll just give one more quick example here. Basically, Dominic Tarr, who is part of the sort of decentralized web ecosystem as well through Secure Scuttlebutt, mentioned that he was maintaining a popular JavaScript library, which he eventually had to give up because of time commitments. And he ended up giving this to someone who gave, publish commit access to someone who he didn't necessarily know that well, because no one else was really stepping up to do it. And that person ended up inserting malicious code into the software, which then caused a lot of people to lose money, in part because of the way it targeted folks who were trading Bitcoin at the time. And it's a really good example because he, I think, gives a very apt analogy of the problems maintainers face, which is, if you're working as a dishwasher at a restaurant, you might be competent by accident or on purpose, and you'll get promoted. You'll become, say, a cook in this example. And, that was only a 50-cent pay rise an hour, but it was massively more responsibility. It wasn't that great, but it's actually still better than the change that happens to maintainers as their modules or libraries get more popular, which is that they sort of have an increase of responsibility, like by a factor of like 1,000, and the pay rise is 0. So anyway, a lot of examples here, but the point really is to hit home. This is a common problem, and it's becoming more common as more and more people are kind of, as one, open source software is becoming more prominent, and two, as people are getting sort of more constrained on their time, especially now with everything that's happening. So how do we solve this problem? What's the option? And this is where, I'm going to first probably present a few things that we're doing on the Gitcoin side, which, by the way, is not a coin. But I'll dive into a broader sort of set of scenarios and solutions as well as I go through this. And so, why is, in one example, why is blockchain TM potentially valuable here? And one of the reasons is that there's kind of a clear value to or at least from my experience, people seem to value open source a lot more than I've seen in Web 2. People really care about sort of this idea of growing an overall ecosystem rather than growing their own projects. And I think that is a very different kind of perspective versus the traditional software ecosystem, which sees open source software as something that can be extracted and that can be used in a sort of private setting. The other reason is that with programmable like money, or money that is open to anyone, there's this ability to distribute that money in a more equitable way and in a faster way. And so this ability to like globally transfer value as easily as sending an email is actually really important to the overall sustainability of open source software. The interesting example here is, you would never have in the 1970s sent like physical mail to your friend to ask if they wanted to go hang out. It just would be like completely ridiculous. Now that's not like uncommon at all to just send a message to someone over the phone or via email. And I think that's becoming more and more common. This, to me, the way that we're sort of transferring value now through these systems is the equivalent for value as that change was for information. And there's also like, a lot of money in blockchain, frankly, at this point, which may or may not be good, but that money is going to devs, it's going to open source, and it's going to things that are built remote first. And all those things, to me, are critical for the growth of open source. So the way I think about this maintainer problem is kind of like a funnel. You start with a lot of users. There's a lot of users in the internet broadly today, and for individual software packages today. And then maybe a few of those people contribute. Say 100 of the 100,000 people that are part of that ecosystem contribute. And then maybe 10 of those actually, at most, become maintainers. So let's look at this. The way I'm approaching this problem is, how do we get people to become contributors first? How do we get them to start being part of this broader ecosystem? And then how do we get them to level up their skills? How do we get them to actually become broader maintainers? And I won't dwell too much on what we're doing here, because the goal really is to talk about the broader ecosystem and how this is actually what some of the solutions are that other people have tried as well. But we do this by trying to incentivize people individually. There's a lot of controversy around bounties. GrataPay by Chad Whitaker is an example of a project that tried to do this and failed. But the goal is really to give people individual sort of actual dollars to fix bugs, to improve features, to do small tasks within a repo. And part of the reason for doing it this way is not to extrinsically motivate people to be part of the open software ecosystem. It's really to get people who are already intrinsically motivated the time that they need to be part of that ecosystem. And that goes back to the point before. There's a lot of folks who would love to get involved in open source software, but they just don't have the time. There's no one who's giving them any money to do it. Their employer doesn't support them working on open source. This gives them the opportunity to be part of that ecosystem and to really engage, at least as a starting point, with these smaller tasks. And this is just an example of one of those that we did with Parity. Again, these are very small amounts. This is actually probably smaller than the average on the site now, because this was created probably about 1.5 years ago. But again, it's a starting point for someone getting involved in the ecosystem, and we've seen probably upwards of 50 people, 50 to 100 people on the platform making money full-time just by doing bounties, although we've kind of accelerated our model to find other ways to get people sustainable monthly funding, which I'll talk about in a bit. And these are some stats on the network, which I won't dive into too much, but I kind of like this visualization because it really shows that like, this is really a network of people. Each person is sort of like a 3D human being. They have their own interests and desires, but they all care about open source software. To me, that's really the key piece. Okay, so we have an idea of how we get users to become contributors. That's our rough sort of plan from before. How do we get those people to become maintainers? And one idea for this is just grants, which is not by itself sustainable. I will admit, it would be nice if grants were enough, but I do not think we are there at this point. That said, I think there's a lot of value in being able to start with a small pool of funds and get the individuals who care about open source, which hopefully, you know, is a number that's increasing over time, to help contribute as well. And so we use this model called Capital Constrained Liberal Radicalism, which was created by Glenn Will and Vitalik and Zoe Hitzeg in a paper in 2018 to try to rally the crowd or community to give funds, not just to give funds ourselves. And so the kind of example here of $250K that we would give out as a matching grant and a total of $475K being contributed to open source is actually a real example that we just ran a couple of months ago with the Ethereum Foundation and others, and it was extremely successful. We've seen a lot of support from the community to core software that we all rely on, at least within the Ethereum ecosystem. And this is the example of, this is the paper that we sort of like based our initial vision on. I would recommend anyone sort of reading through if they're sort of interested in this sort of idea. I know it might be a bit dense in terms of the overall economic modeling, but I think it's a really good read. And I think it's very interesting to sort of understand these systems, especially like the quadratic voting and quadratic funding parts in more detail. And so I'll maybe explain a bit about how that system works. In short, what we're doing is, as sort of implied by the quadratic voting, quadratic funding idea, is matching the square of the sum of the square roots of contributions to basically give to individual projects. And the way this looks in practice is basically multiple individuals will give, say one person gives $275. If this was a one-to-one matching system, they would only be able to actually match 550 total dollars, 275 matched with another 275. In this model, if we had, say, 10 people donate, that number actually increases quite dramatically, because what we care about here is the number of individual donors, not necessarily the dollar values contributed. So in the case of 10 donors, the matching amount that's given in addition to the 275 that the community is given is actually over $3,000. And one of the things that's important to note here is obviously these numbers will scale pretty rapidly. We want to, and this is where the capital constraint component comes in, we want to cap these by the matching pool that's being set in advance of the round. So if $100,000 is available to be matched, the amount that these folks would get would be the percentage, the appropriate percentage of that matching pool. So we effectively normalize the numbers to match the pool, just so that the numbers for the matching pool don't get out of hand relative to what we have available to actually donate on our side. And these are just some examples. They're actually a bit low because I've not updated these for a little while on my side, so it's my fault. But there's a lot of these that have actually received over $20,000 at this point in more recent rounds. I think the most recent round actually had over 9,000 individual unique contributors, which is pretty amazing just to see that level of support. Obviously, this kind of model works better when there's more signal from individuals, because that's really the goal, is to democratize the funding. So if we are really able to actually provide that democratized funding at scale, I think this can be applied not just to the Ethereum ecosystem, but also to broader open source software, which is where our interest and our mission as an organization lies. But these are all still patronage-based solutions. So everything that I mentioned is largely relying on the kindness of strangers or their own self-interest. And so how do we move beyond those models to something that will sustainably fund public goods, even in the absence of those things? And so one idea would be inflation funding. Inflation funding is not really a new idea. Effectively, inflation funding is a tax, and taxes, themselves are not particularly new. The only things that are certain in life are death and taxes. But I think there is a very strong argument to be made for applying these kinds of taxes, which I think anyone arguing for these would kill me for calling them. In order to, I think it's really important to go forward with these in order to kind of sustain an ecosystem that, by the way, does benefit from giving up these funds to vote on projects and ideas that they think will increase the value of the overall ecosystem. So there's a bit of coercion in this model, in the sense that by opting into, say, the Ethereum ecosystem with this EIP, you would now be required to, as a miner, give up some of your rewards. But in exchange for giving up those rewards, ideally, the value of the token, the value of the ecosystem at large increases, which is interesting. It's not really the kind of thing that was possible before blockchain, in the sense that you never really, especially now in North America, at least, maybe 10% of the population in the USA participates in the stock market. So when you give taxes to the US government, you might think, well, maybe that'll increase the value of my overall investments. But the problem is that no one, except for a very small percentage of people, are actually sharing in the benefit of those investments. So any of this money that goes back into the ecosystem is not really getting distributed back to folks that care about it. And the difference in Ethereum is that anyone really can be part of this ecosystem and own tokens that are part of this ecosystem. And I think it's a broader distribution of people that are getting that benefit. And so, there's a much stronger argument, I think, to be made for almost every party that providing these kinds of taxes will be long run beneficial and will not only help those people that need the funding, but also come back to kind of lift all boats, as the saying goes. And so I think that's a very different scenario, in part because I think, and I may be biased, I think there's less corruption. and less overall sort of like structural failure in the Ethereum ecosystem than there is in the US government, which may be political a statement to make, depending on my audience here. But I think these models are really interesting. This is just one other example, a more particular example of what that model, that tax would look like. And none of these have moved forward at this point. These are just ideas, but I think it's worth discussing them. And it's worth discussing how these kinds of models can be pursued, not just in the blockchain ecosystem, but in open source software more broadly. I know that SourceCred is working on sort of value allocation method that is similar to this in some ways, that is very interesting for anyone who wants to dive in. I can share the link in the chat after. And then I wanted to, like, just with my last few minutes, dive into a few other options for supporting open source software here. One is by Barasa Bugudj, who is a maintainer in the JavaScript ecosystem for a number of libraries, a number of NPM packages, which collectively, I believe, get upwards of 50 to 100 million downloads a month. And these are libraries that obviously a lot of people care about. And what he thought was, if there are a lot of people that rely on these, maybe there are actually a few larger organizations that would be willing to give me some amount of money on a monthly basis to basically provide support. There's this idea of, and this is a much more sort of like consulting model, to be fair, but there's this idea of like service level agreements in software maintenance and support. And basically what he was saying in writing this idea up was, what if we just had SLAs for open source software and basically made sure that maintainers were paid for that time that they're spending making these fixes that large companies or other large benefactors are requesting or need. So this is just one example of a more kind of market-based model rather than public goods funding-based model, but I think it's interesting and worth looking at. And then the other one, which got him a lot of criticism, this is another project by Firas, was actually advertising. What he did basically was put this little message, this advertisement into the npm install for his packages on the terminal itself. And so anyone who wanted to use his packages would still have to see these ads. It was not met, with the most positive response that I mentioned, but I think there's a lot of value in how this idea could evolve. And I think we shouldn't, I think as a society, we've looked back on advertising pretty negatively, in part because of how it's being used by large platforms like Facebook and so on. But I think there's a lot of value in
blocking your page?
Use this open source software.
It's okay. It's blocking your screen. Push it out.
Hey, everything okay? Can you hear me? Still there? Cool. So just to kind of finalize, really the thing I wanted to hit home here was we've got a lot of these ideas that I think are open for anyone to pursue. We are also personally pursuing the advertising model ourselves with more of an ethical model that does not track anyone, does not violate anyone's privacy. That to me is still a good way to effectively, and maybe the better term for this kind of thing is sponsorship. So when you put someone's logo on your page, they're sponsoring your work. I think that's the better way to view this, rather than the Facebook model where you're tracking someone's every movement in order to try to better tailor to them. And then finally, you know, there's a lot of these models. I haven't touched on all of them. And Natty Eggball has a great repo on GitHub called the Lemonade Stand, which I would recommend everyone who is interested to look at. So that's pretty much it. You know, if anyone wants to talk about this, I'd love to jam on it further. Really, for me, what we're trying to solve for, and what I'm trying to solve for is like, how do we make open source software sustainable? And more broadly, how do we make public goods funding sustainable? And this is just one small part of that. So thanks everyone for listening, and hope this was helpful. And I'm happy to answer any questions.